by Mark Stevenson from the University of Wisconsin, and Mark just finished his presentation on understanding our trading partner, obviously the U.S. Thanks for taking some time, Mark.
Sure, happy to do that.
Hey, an interesting picture that you painted of U.S. dairy farming, and specifically, I think a couple of things I wanted to touch on was, the growth of larger herds. You mentioned that, most of the growth now is in the herds 2,000 cows or greater.
Yes, and it tends to be something that's not obvious and visible to a lot of people, but when you start to add cows in 3,000 animal increments, and many of those farms are doing that, then that's a lot of milk production. And it does displace a number of 100-cow operations.
Yeah, and you mentioned, about half of the milk produced is produced by 3% of the farms, right? So
that's right.
Really intensive. You broke the U.S. basically into three quadrants, basically. Traditional and intensive having problems. Can you explain that?
Yeah, the traditional regions of the country are kind of the northeastern quadrant of the United States, and these are areas where we've had dairy farms for decades, and they tend to produce at least their forage needs, if not almost all of their feed needs. That's why I call them traditional dairy farms. Farms in the western half of the country have been farms that have felt liberated to buy a lot of their feed needs. So, they've invested mostly in the productive assets of cows, and they explored some of those economies of scale, much larger farms earlier than has been true in the other part of the country. The southeastern portion of the country is an area that's having some real problems. Our increasingly high yields on milk cows means that they've got a lot of body heat to dissipate, and as they do that, it's harder for them to produce that milk in a degree of comfort in the hot and humid areas of the United States.
Let's talk about where the milk is. You mentioned you're in surplus in the Northeast, surplus in the West. What does that surplus look like?
Well, the surplus in the Northeast tends to be the Midwest portion of the country. So Michigan, for example, Wisconsin, Minnesota, those states have a lot more milk than they have population and need for milk products. If you take a look at the Northeast, a lot of people over there, and they're slightly deficit, but in total that region has plenty of milk. If you look at the far west, the real growth that we've seen in Idaho, a lot of cows, not many people. California even, a lot of people, but a lot more cows too. So they are surplus in milk production, and substantially so.
You talked about the business model of U.S. farms changing, and that is, larger farms are purchasing now land. We've got issues with manure and actually growing their own forage.
Yep, and what that does when you do that is that these are assets that some of those intensive farms of the West didn't really want to own. They're expensive to buy land, and the machinery to plant and harvest feeds. But when you do that, you also moderate some of the costs that you have on purchased feeds, and you have access to land to be able to supply manure. That gives you higher fixed costs on a farm, lower variable costs.
Right. Now, you mentioned that, the U.S. is really trying to sort out what you're going to be when you grow up. But you said exporting and being an exporting market is certainly where you're going to be. Do you have a sense of how aggressive that's going to be? What does the U.S. milk market look like in 5-10 years?
Well, it depends a great deal on demand and opportunities that we have. When you look at some of the traditional exporting regions, Oceania, New Zealand, Australia, they haven't got a lot more area to duplicate the kind of business model that they've had, which is pasture-based system. They've started to explore a little bit more with supplemental feeding, and in fact are backing away from that now as their costs have gotten pretty big. So they're looking at how to become a little bit more like the U.S., while the U.S. is trying to wonder if we can lower some of our variable costs of production. Well, I was just going to say, EU has recently come off of quotas, and they've had a real burst in milk production. I think that's a short-term burst. I think that basically they're going to grow much more slowly in the next several years. But nevertheless, we have to see what the opportunities are for sales. We have a lot of opportunities for export sales. We'd be happy to meet them.
Yeah. perceptions of Canada. Here we are, the CDX in Ontario. You basically said, in a sense, that a lot of Americans are kind of not jealous, but you look north and there's a lot of great resources there. Obviously, there's a system that is different. Your perception of Canada?
Well, first I'll start with those agronomic resources. You've got a perfect climate for dairy and milk production. It's cool. It's still productive in terms of growing forage needs and grain, those types of things. So you've really got everything that we have in the top tier of states like Wisconsin, Minnesota, New York, the places where we produce a lot of milk. You also have a very different system in place here with the quota that has given your prices about double what our prices are at this point in time and more stable. So I think it makes life a lot easier, but in the sense that you can plan on what your incomes are going to be much better. The one thing that quotas I think often do for people is not only supply that, but they give you the urge to produce more because I'm profitable at this level. I would like to produce more, but doing so requires that acquisition of the quota, which is pretty expensive.
What about your sense of, I guess a final question on the U.S. We've talked in the past about trade agreements, TPP, and various other things. Is there a sense that the U.S. obviously is going to be very aggressive here? You've got extra milk, surplus milk, and that needs a home.
It does need a home, and of course we would be more than happy to supply customers just north of the border. But to the extent that we have access to that, I'm sure we'd be willing to do that. But we aren't really looking at that as a primary target at this point in time. You used to be our number 2 trading partner. Now you're number 3. We're supplying more to China than we do to Canada. That was opportunity for growth in Asian markets. And I think we still see our real growth opportunities being Asian markets temporarily, maybe North Africa, a little bit further out in the future.
Well, Marky, thank you for your time today, and hope you enjoyed your trip north.
I've enjoyed it immensely. Thank you.